Now on Overnights,
I believe in reason and common sense.
Leith Van Onselen from Macro Business with the Treasury of Common Sense.
Common sense never goes out of style.
Leith joins Luke Grant every couple of weeks and with me over the last few weeks. G'day, Leith.
G'day, Clinton. How are you?
I'm good, mate. I'm good. It seems like we talk about similar topics each week, but the issues of migration and what the Prime Minister is, let's say, inflicting on the country are so prominent at the moment, and I reckon this is starting to affect him in the opinion polls. There's definitely a turn in the polls.
Oh, absolutely, mate. It seems like, left, right and centre now, people are starting to talk about this issue, even outfits that wouldn't do it previously. So we saw it, a week or so ago, Peter Costello came out and called for lower immigration, and a few other people have as well. And even the ABC this week wrote a very good article, basically blaming immigration for the whole rental crisis and the housing crisis, which they don't usually do. They don't generally want to mention the I word.
Yes.
So it is becoming a lot more prevalent now across pretty much all media outlets, and the pressure is definitely building up. And you can see it in this week's Roy Morgan opinion poll. And what it actually shows is that the Albanese government's fallen behind the coalition. So on a two-party third basis, the Albanese government's at 49.5%, whereas the coalition's at 50.5%. Now, obviously, it's not a big lead, but the fact of the matter is, they're only 18 months into the term. Usually first-term governments have it fairly easy, and they obviously come into office after 9 years of the coalition. So you think that they'd be coming in with a big head of steam. Obviously, Scott Morrison was very unpopular when he left, and they've already burnt that goodwill in about 18 months. And the most disturbing thing is that the primary vote of the ALP is collapsed to just 29.5%. So that's first preferences versus a coalition who's risen to 37.5%. So basically, this Labor government was elected on a really low primary vote. It was the worst primary vote for an elected government for decades, I believe. And so it wasn't a case of people loving Albo and loving Labor and wanting Labor to come in. It was because they were sick of Scott Morrison. And what that basically meant is that, initially in the first 6 months, obviously he was very popular, sort of came in with that halo glow, a bit like Kevin Rudd did. And within just 18 months, voters have turned against him. And I think it really does relate back to this whole immigration issue, because Australians, and I talk to heaps of people, and they can't believe that we're just basically engineering this whole rental crisis in Australia. We don't have enough homes. The construction, the whole supply side of the housing market's stuffed, quite frankly. And yet he's fire hosing in all these extra people week after week and just making the problem worse. And we've got record low rental vacancy rates. We've obviously got rents going through the roof. People are struggling. People are being forced to live in the group housing. They're made homeless. And, it's sort of got to the stage now where if you go past some parks now, you actually see people living in tents. And, people notice that. And, everyone's got friends of friends or whatever who are affected by it. So it's starting to blow back, and people are starting to say, look, what the hell's going on here? Why are you doing this?
I mentioned this to you a little earlier, that I was with the New South Wales Premier yesterday, Chris Minns, at a press conference, as I am sort of daily. And there's a story about what's called the Greater Cities Commission in New South Wales being abolished. And the reason for that is it's a level of bureaucracy the government believes is getting in the way of speeding up development, speeding up more medium to high density, more apartment blocks. And Chris Minns is hell-bent on building more in Sydney's northern suburbs and eastern suburbs because he believes that the west has taken on too much of the load. And I appreciate that. But I put to him the example that, okay, if you're going to pile more people into Mossman's been one of the suburbs that's been listed. The worst, everyone agrees, one of the worst roads in Sydney by far is Military Road. Absolutely congested all the time. That's centred around Mossman. You cram more apartment buildings into that, how does Military Road cope? And the government, what do they do when they came to power? They scrapped the plan for a bypass tunnel to the northern beaches. So cars keep using Military Road.
It's absolutely crazy. And this is happening not just, obviously in Sydney, it's happening all over the place, because you've just seen the federal government try and cancel all these infrastructure projects. Well, I'm sorry, if you're bringing 500,000 people every year, which is the current run rate, you need to provide infrastructure for them, because if you don't, we're going to live in sardine cans. You're going to be stuck in congestion everywhere. And this whole solution by Chris Minns is really just whack-a-mole. Like, he's trying to solve one problem, which is overdevelopment in the western suburbs, which is a real thing. by just forcing overdevelopment in other areas. Well, how about he gets on the phone to Albo and he says, mate, slow this down, cut the migration intake. We cannot take this number of people. Sydney didn't cope well the previous 15 years before the pandemic when we had, huge levels of immigration. Same with Melbourne. And it's sure as heck not going to cope with double the rate of immigration that we've got now. And, everyone's living it, and people are quite frankly getting fed up with it. And there's nothing worse than seeing people basically being made homeless or, struggling to put a roof over their head. And that's the ultimate result.
I had a look at my mortgage the other day, and look, I guess I'm fortunate in a way. I've had my mortgage now for 12 years. So over that course of that 12 years, you make a fair bit of progress on it. But I was reviewing it the other day and looking at what my repayments are. And then you look at now what people who are renting are paying, and you're thinking, my goodness, I thought my repayments were horrific. Certainly they were when I took the mortgage out. It's cheaper than rent.
Yeah, mate, it's crazy. So basically, mortgage repayments have gone up over 50% since the RBA started hiking if you're on a variable rate mortgage. And rents have gone up about 30% since the pandemic began. So, I'm in a similar situation to you. I've basically been in my house for 10 years now, so I've paid off a fair chunk of it. But even then, it still hurts.
Oh, absolutely.
But if you're one of those people who've bought fairly, in the last couple of years, you're obviously going to be in a lot of trouble. Or if you're renting, you're in a lot of trouble. And at least if you've got a house, you're not made to move and you've got, at least you're working towards something. But if you're renting, you're just trying to put a roof over your head. And there's really there's really no upside to this. We have basically three Australias at the moment. We've got 1/3 roughly that rents, 1/3 that's paying off a mortgage, and 1/3 that doesn't rent and isn't paying off a mortgage. They own the homes outright, and they tend to be older. And that third is doing really well at the moment. So some data came out this week from CBA. It actually showed that their spending levels have rocketed in the last year. So they're spending like drunken sailors, whereas the youngest cohorts are cutting back really hard, and they tend to be the renters and also people who've got new mortgages. And the rest in between, those sort of middle ages have spending a little bit, but they're spending less than inflation.
Now, that rolls into what Michelle Bullock, the new RBA governor, said on Wednesday. She made a speech to economists, and she said inflation at the moment, it's actually not being driven by international factors. She said it's being driven by local spending, which is still too high. Now, you mentioned that the three sectors of the economy. She says she won't hesitate to increase interest rates again. So that's affecting primarily, to start with, that 1/3. It's not. You mentioned that the older people who are spending up, it's not necessarily going to affect. It'll flow through, I guess, eventually, but not immediately.
Yeah, and it's the most stupid blunt tool that we've got. So basically, you've got and I don't necessarily blame the RBA for this because they've only got one tool, right? So to them, they're a hammer and everything's a nail. So their interest rates only directly impact 1/3 of Australians because they're the ones with mortgages. And they're the ones who get smashed directly. But then it also will feed into higher rents eventually because once you raise interest rates, you're going to stifle housing supply because it makes it more expensive to either take out a mortgage to build a new house, and also it becomes more expensive to develop because developers carry debt. So you're going to then that's going to then cascade into rents down the track. And what we really need is a circuit breaker. And the circuit breaker must come from the federal government. The federal government has a whole range of tools it can use to slow inflation. The Reserve Bank's only got one. And the best tool would simply be to slow this migration down, like slow it down. Because obviously if you're adding 500,000 people every year, you're going to put a rocket under rents and you're raising demand, even though households in total are cutting back. The fact that we're adding more households than households are cutting back means that demand keeps going up. So the RBA's got to respond by ratcheting rates even higher on just 1/3 of people. So that's effectively what we need. We need the federal government to cut. And the thing that annoys me the most about the RBA is I understand they've only got one tool, so they can't do much about that. But why aren't they being a lot more vocal about this? Why aren't they saying directly, in the public and also privately, Michelle Bullock should be saying to Albanese, you've got to cut immigration and you've got to help us in other ways because you aren't doing your job. We're operating, you're basically operating at cross purposes to us. We're trying to slow the economy down, you're trying to speed it up. We've got the foot on the brake, you've got the foot on the accelerator, and you're creating a burnout economy. And, you're doing this by fire hosing in 500,000 extra people every year who are spending and create all this demand in the economy. So you've got to stop that because otherwise we're just going to have to keep ratcheting rates higher and higher and higher. and it will eventually send us into recession, and it's going to cause untold pain on the 1/3 of Australians that have mortgages, and then eventually people, renters as well. So it's just an absolute diabolical situation here. We've got the whole governance of this country is just back to front, and it's not working.
Yeah, you've summed it up really well. You've summed up what the actual root cause of these problems are, and unfortunately, politicians are always looking for the quick fix, unfortunately. We can read all about it on your excellent website. It is Macro Business. Thank you, Leith.
Cheers, Clinton. Anytime.